Hello, Dalton. Good afternoon. Are you connected from your phone?
Yeah, I'm connected on my phone, yes.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are around the world. You are welcome to this panel discussion, Beyond the Crisis, Scaling Up International Partnerships for Africa's Transition on Clean Development Drive. My name is Ejeviome Elohotobo. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. It's a pleasure to join you today and to serve as the moderator of this event. There are three issues that frames this discussion. One is the global commitment to bring emissions below 1.50%. In other words, to cut emissions so that temperatures do not arrive above 1.5% by 2050. Second is the effect on climate change in Africa, which is the region of discussion today. As many people are aware, Africa has contributed least to the climate crisis, but it risks being one of the major adversely impacted regions in the world, both because of geography. There are a number of island countries in the region, and also landlocked countries that are in the edges of drought areas like the Sahel and Sahara Desert. Therefore, the challenge for Africa is both how to pursue policies that contribute to mitigation as well as adaptation. And within that context, how more importantly, they can fulfill their national commitments, what they call nationally determined contributions to reduction of climate change. The third component is partnership, because ultimately, the partnership is required at many levels. Partnership in terms of partnerships between the governments and the private sector that will have both most of the resources and the technical know-how. Partnerships between African governments and governments in other regions of the world that have contributed to the climate crisis, but also have the technology and the resources. And talking about resources, this leads me to the debate that has already erupted about what is needed. At the Copenhagen COP15 conference, it was agreed, developed countries agreed to pledge 100 billion per annum to support the developing countries. Now, there are two recent reports that shows that this amount is inadequate. One of them is the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance. UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Crisis. It projected 5.8 to 5.9 trillion up to 2030. Then there is the UNEP report of 2019, which is called the Emission Gap. The report suggested that developing countries will need 1.6 to 3.8 trillion per annum to 2030 in order to adopt policies that will bring the global temperature to the 1.5 degree Celsius. In the meantime, other analyses show that, in fact, during that period, not only have the OECD countries that pledged not lived up to this pledged amount, but it has fallen. One of the reasons it has fallen is, of course, the COVID crisis that we have experienced, but more importantly, the lack of commitment, lack of political commitment in most of the countries. And this as a result of many factors: nationalist governments, the political lack of public support for that funding. With that in mind, we have a very distinguished panel of speakers. We have Aaron Leopold, who is the Chief Executive Officer of ENIGRO that is based in Uganda and is a former Director of Sustainable Development at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. And we have Rob Davies, a former Minister of Trade of the Republic of South Africa. So I'm going to give them the floor briefly so that they can kick off the debate. And I'm going to give the floor first to Rob Davies, who is going to speak on partnerships and policies by African countries for clean energy transition. Mr. Davis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to yourself and also to the Africa Business Roundtable for this invitation. I think my point of departure is going to be to take a step a little bit backwards and to actually ask, what does Africa need in this transition, and then try to, from that, build what kind of partnerships do we need to build to realize those objectives. And I want to begin by saying that I think that the IFCC report that came out earlier this year is telling us that, in fact, we need more ambitious commitments if we are going to avoid rising temperatures above the 1.5 degree level, which initiates a great crisis. It's also telling us, and I think this is very relevant, that even if we muster the political will to do that, which is a rather big if, that there will still be extreme weather events caused by the global warming that's already been happening. And this will impact on our continent as well as other parts of the world in different ways, in droughts, in floods, in rising sea levels, and all of the things associated with global warming. So I think that the real issue is that we are likely to be going through a rather significant and rather disruptive transition to a lower carbon economy. I think that is inevitably what's going to happen. This transition is something which I think the many people around the world are saying needs to be a just transition. And a just transition is one that promotes inclusivity, allows those parts of the world which are less developed to actually develop, and peoples to achieve what their overall objectives are in terms of a better life. Now, I think if we look at the challenge facing the continent, it's long been said that if Africa is going to develop, we need to break out of what colonialism set us in. And that is a position as producers and exporters only of primary commodities that are sold to support industries outside of our borders. That's where we were placed under colonialism, and that's where in many respects most of us have remained to this day. And I think that if this transition to a lower carbon economy is not going to just bring negatives and high adjustment costs to Africa, it's actually got to result in us having a fair and equitable share of the industrial development opportunities that this is going to bring. If it doesn't, and if we are simply just relegated to being consumers of technologies that are produced elsewhere as we make this transition, I think that the negatives are going to outweigh the positives of this adjustment. And I just want to give one example, because the Paris commitments that have been made, not just by ourselves, but also by our trading partners, are actually quite significant, and I think more significant than many of us perhaps realized. There was a study done about my own country, South Africa, and it said that the Paris commitments would lead to assets to the value of about 1.8 trillion rand, which is about 60% of our GDP. These would be decommissioned as a result of the implementation of the Paris commitments, not just by ourselves, but for example, in the case of South Africa, if countries move away from coal and stop buying our exported coal, that will lead to the decommissioning of terminals that are dedicated to coal exports, for example. And similar cases, I think, would be found in other countries of the world, particularly those that are involved in the production of oil-based products as well. So what are we going to do as we move to greener energy, renewable energy and things of that sort, electric vehicles, hydrogen-powered vehicles and so on? What are we going to do? And I think that we've got to get our share of the manufacturing opportunities. And I think that we already do have some capacity in this regard. There is already on the continent in some places the production of windmill towers that produce windmill energy. There is already the production of photovoltaic cells. There is the production of many other components of renewable energy supply equipment. There is already a motor vehicle industry. This motor vehicle industry will have to make a transition and ensure that it's not just left as producing petrol-powered vehicles if the world is moving rapidly into battery-powered or fuel cell-powered vehicles. In my own country, South Africa, there have been experiments about the use of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles for underground mining operations, as well as for public transport vehicles. Now, if we're going to get this and make this transition benefit us, we've got to become industrialists and producers of the new technologies. We have in place, I think, one very, very important mechanism, and that is the African Continental Free Trade Area, which many of us around the continent have said is not just a free trade arrangement of the orthodox kind, but has to be something that supports the emergence of regional value chains, which can support the move to higher value added productive activities. Some of that can be the value chains that are going to be dedicated to the production of green technologies and renewable energy. I think that's the challenge for us, that we have to ensure that that takes place. For that to happen, I think that the partnerships we require have actually got to unblock this commitment on financial resources. I know this is going to be a tough ask. I think we also need to be very, very careful that we are not sold something which is not really a reality. That while we can, I think, accept that some of these resources are going to come from the private sector, that doesn't mean that we must accept that the only way this is going to happen is if there are mechanisms in place that offer very, very high levels of guarantees and high levels of profit to institutions that get involved in this. I think if that is the case, if that's supposed to be the route and the only route that's available to us, we're going to find that we're going to have high cost and low yield flows of fund. We need to unblock that funding, and we also need to ensure that there is investment. But we also need to ensure that there's a policy framework in place, an international policy framework in place. It's got to allow us to use the policy tools of industrial policy to support the emergence of green industries across the continent. It's got to recognize that we are at a lower stage of development of those technologies, and that we need to use tools like localization, preferences in the continental free trade area, and so on and so forth. And that means, I think, that any kind of premature opening up of free trade flows in the name of supporting green industries through premature trade liberalization is likely to lead to the reproduction of the existing situation where a few of the bigger economies of the world will be the producers and we will remain the consumers of their products. So I think that things like the discussions that have taken place about trading environmental goods, where the whole idea is to have zero tariffs on any goods that are counted as environmental goods. If this was to come into place and it undermined the preferences that we could provide in the continental free trade area for goods which are produced on our continent, that would undermine industrialization. I also think that we need to be very wary of things like behind the border measures of the sort that border adjustment taxes and things of that sort, which are going to penalize our exports in the name of supporting green activities and ensuring that there's a lower carbon footprint. And I think that any measures of this sort need to be multilateral in nature and not bilateral. So I think that we need an understanding from partners in the world outside that we need to use the tools that they themselves used as they themselves were industrializing, as we industrialize and try to adjust to the transition towards the lower carbon economy. Final point I'd make is that I think, and this is where I think some of the funding comes in, we need a big infrastructure build and rehabilitation to climate-proof our infrastructure against the extreme weather events that are inevitable, even if we manage to avoid the catastrophic climate change that the COP26 and other COPs have been trying to avert. So I think that a massive infrastructure build, climate proof, to ensure that those where floods and those kind of disasters, hydrological disasters, are a risk, that we improve against that. Where we defend our populations against drought, and where populations may have to move, and we have to build new facilities for populations that have moved out of areas that have become desertified, where we reinforce our coastal areas and cities, and try to resist some of the impacts of extreme weather events. All of that, if properly managed, could create jobs, could create industrial activities. And I think that is the kind of transition, or the elements of the transition that one could call just. And I think this is something that Africa needs to insist upon, that we have a right to justice in any kind of transition to a low carbon economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, for that very thoughtful piece in which you have focused, brought the link between trade, infrastructure, technology, and financing to bear on the discussion. Well, I very much appreciate that. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Arion Leopold, who is going to speak on partnership between the EU and African countries for clean energy transition. Arion, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful to the organizers and everyone participating for all their hard work putting this together. I'm going to speak about a few different topics relating both to what to the topic of the event itself, but then also to look at really what these partnerships can bring in terms of on the ground progress. So moving away from multilateral discussions and looking at, okay, well, what happens on the ground when partnerships can start to work. So I've been working on rural electrification in Africa for about 15 years, all focused on renewables, and I've been in the climate space for a long time as well. And the reason why I want to be focusing on the ground sort of outcomes of these discussions of the Africa EU Energy Partnership, UNFCCC, etc., is really that yes, decisions matter, but they only matter as much as they are implemented and as much as they're implementable. And I went to my first summit of the Africa Energy EU, the Africa EU Energy Partnership in 2010. And there we saw very, very similar words to what we are hearing now at COP26 about the need for local empowerment, about the need for a green revolution, about the 100 billion per year, etc. And the continual resounding reason why we're not seeing huge amounts of action on the ground, these are the words of the decision makers, is we don't have enough bankable projects. We don't have enough projects. And what does that mean? Well, of course we have projects. We have huge solar systems that can come up. We have enormous wind manufacturing capability, as was mentioned by the previous speaker. So why isn't the money coming in? And what I'm working on now, I'm running a renewable energy supporting company in Uganda. And for the past 3 years, I was the CEO of the Africa Mini Grid Developers Association, which is the industry association of all of the companies focusing on village electrification in rural areas in Africa. And the resounding reason why we are not getting these bankable projects is because the rural African and the average African, in the eyes of investors, is still a huge unknown risk. Very little is understood about the average African that is not banked, that has a smartphone but isn't registered in any credit agencies. And in order to get $1 billion into a renewable energy project, you have to have $1 billion worth of customers. And investors really don't understand how they can safely put $1 billion in loans or in debt in a lot of these markets that we have to see changes in. And I therefore would like to move away from the discussion around gigatons and billions of dollars, and really to build multilateral partnerships and relationships around building markets for renewable energy businesses, for workers, for projects, etc. We hear in many, and this is not to be taken negatively. We hear in many multilateral forum that we, as people residing in developing countries, citizens of developing countries, governments of developing countries, we should be exploiting the resources that we have because that's what everyone else did, and it's our turn. But the one thing that they are forgetting when they mention this is Africa's most valuable resources are not in the ground. Africa's most valuable resources are its people. And we have to be empowering the people to be able to get engineering jobs, get renewable energy jobs, build renewable energy industries. When I was in one of my first COPs, this was in like 2008 or 9, I spoke to the Minister of Finance of Egypt, which at that time, this was before the Arab Spring, middle income country, nearly. And he was arguing against huge amounts of money coming into developing countries. And I asked him why afterwards. And he said, because in 2 years, they'll realize that they can't spend that much money because there's no labor force and there's no projects. And then they'll recant the offer. They will remove that offer because they'll say it cannot be done. We have to do something else. And my urge for multilateral discussions between Africa and EU, between every multilateral agency, including the UNFCCC here, is that money doesn't matter if you can't spend it. You can have a house made of gold. And you know what? If nobody wants gold, your house is a heavy, shiny object, and it is nothing more. And if we have $100 billion per year, but we can't spend it, then we don't have anything. We don't have anything. And I think the multilateralism has to start at building up these opportunities for that money to flow and for the manufacturing to take place. In Kenya last year, they taxed solar panels because they thought that it was a good idea to promote local manufacturing. And so there was exemption for locally manufactured solar panels for 1 year. And we, as the industry associations at that time, we had to fight against this to say, Kenya, you are right. You should have local manufacturing. But first, we have to set up the preconditions for that manufacturing to make sense. Because next year, no manufacturer is coming. China is still way cheaper for all the solar panels in the world. We need to build those foundational areas of the economy so that we can have the local manufacturing without getting in the way of progress, like accidentally doing something like taxing renewables when we think it makes sense for the economy in the long run, but we don't set up anything for the long run, so nothing's going to change, except we're now taxing renewables in Kenya. This was locally removed a couple of months ago by the industry associations working together with the Parliament and the Ministry of Energy in Kenya to find a way to bridge the gap, the financial gap. And by the way, that tax was not made out of ignorance. That was made because the government of Kenya was being pressured by its donor partners because so much spending was coming because of COVID that they had to tax something to bring in government revenues. And they were put in such a desperate situation that they decided, well, maybe we should tax renewables. And I think this also goes to my point that we have to create a broad understanding of the benefits of setting these foundations for these opportunities. And if we're not careful, we can make big mistakes like the ones I just mentioned. But it really starts with the people. And I'll leave it at that. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thanks once more.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for tying together for us the discussion on partnership and linking it to the question of building up capacity, because that's an important point you've just raised. If the capacity is not built, then the possibility of using the resources that flow in will become all the more difficult. And then the banks, both private and public and international, will say there are no bankable projects because the people are not able to produce such projects, and more importantly, are not able to implement them even when they are drafted by other people. So I think it's a very important point. And I'm glad that you linked it up to your African Microgrid Association, what they have done. I just wanted to ask Dotun whether there is going to be another speaker, because from what I've seen here, Yamkwela is not here. And what is the plan going from here? Hello?
At this point, we should go ahead and open up to the interactive session, question and answers.
Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. So I want to open it up for interactive section, and if if I may crave the indulgence of the group, I want to exercise my privilege as the moderator to ask a few questions to the first two speakers, but I will not abuse it. So I will just ask one question to each of the previous speakers. The first person would be Rob Davis. And yeah, I know that in South Africa, your country compared to the number of others in sub-Saharan Africa is very much developed in terms of this conversion of coal to some sort of energy resource other than using it as coal. I think you used to have a company called Sasol that was involved in this. And I just wanted to ask you, what experience or lessons can we draw from the work of Sasol in this transition that we are talking about? Then for Aaron, my question is, based on your experience in Uganda, and you said something which is very, very interesting, and it's always caught to the heart of the matter, the question of the rural areas, because in most of the electricity grids in Africa, the rural areas tend to be insignificant both in government planning and in distribution of energy to them. So based on your experience, how do you think that process can be corrected, taking into account the need to have clean energy? Thank you. Over to both of you.
Starting with me, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. No, thank you. Well, I mean, let me just say that Sasol was historically, it was a state-owned company during the apartheid period. It was developed, in fact, before apartheid, really. Its prime role was that it used a German technology to convert coal into liquid fuel.
Exactly.
And at one stage, nearly half the liquid petroleum that was used in South Africa was coming from Sasol. It was subject to all kinds of interventions because it was not as competitive as oil when oil was cheaper. But as the oil price went up, it became much more competitive. More recently, Sasol has now become a private company, and it doesn't really, expand its operations in what it used to do. It's much more going around the world and looking to convert gas into liquid fuel. So I don't know what its future in terms of renewables is, because I think it's a company that's been based on the hydrocarbon economy. It also does have a chemical capacity of hydrocarbons. So that's what it has been. But I think probably more interesting is that the state-owned electricity company, Eskom, which has run coal-fired power stations. Our main power in South Africa is from coal power, is now also itself looking to turn some of its older coal-fired power stations, decommission them as such, and turn some of them into renewables. Some of them are projects which are not necessarily about generating renewable electricity for the grid, but a small-scale agricultural projects using renewable energy. So it's beginning to bite the bullet and recognize the necessity of making that transition. I don't know yet, because Sasol has been doing more of its work abroad than in South Africa. It's invested in a big project in Louisiana in the United States. I don't know yet how it sees itself in terms of a transition to a lower carbon economy and a shift away from hydrocarbons.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Aaron.
Yeah, complicated topic, Mr. Davies, for this forum. But I think actually the simple question that was asked of me as well is no less complicated. So, working on rural electrification, I've been focusing, of course, with the industry association on policy and finance. That's what a lot of industry associations focus on. But the missing component of what is making rural electrification in Africa difficult, it goes to the question exactly, is looking at the high cost of distribution. And the one thing that was missing from my work before was this bankable projects point that I had mentioned before. And what we really see in all of the distribution and an energy connection game that we're playing now, we're trying to achieve SDG 7, is really the enormous cost of bringing connections to rural areas versus the tiny amount of economic activity in those communities. And so we see a massive imbalance in the cost of supply versus the economics of demand in those rural communities. And my company right now, Energrow, we are trying to be the solution to that problem. So what do? We provide microfinance to newly connected energy customers for equipment that they can use to increase their incomes. So this is carpentry equipment, refrigerators, tailoring, sewing machines, welding equipment, all this kind of stuff. And this is actually at the core of helping bring demand for renewable energy up into these rural communities to a level where it looks attractive to investors. And this is going back to my point before, that multilateralism in the 21st century really has to be as much about fairness as it is about opportunity and creating real markets for those opportunities. And I think, yeah, you hit it right on the head. Actually, one of the biggest travesties in the world is going to the hydroelectric dams in northern Uganda and in Kenya. Both countries produce more than 2x what they consume. They produce double the amount of energy consumed here, and it goes through transmission lines over the villages, and it doesn't go down to them because those villages have very little economic argument for the energy companies. And so really, by boosting that economic argument for those rural communities, those lines will have an argument to go down finally, and we'll see these countries consuming as much as they are producing. I'll leave it at that because I feel like I'm getting enthusiastic, but distracted from our multilateralism topic. So I'll let you, let's get back to the politics here.
Okay, thank you very much. And the floor is now open for any other person who wants to ask questions following my questions. Over to anyone.
I would have a question for Dotun, maybe for the audience.
Okay.
What was the motivation for the roundtable to organize this specific session?
Well, the African Business Roundtable was founded by the African Development Bank, private sector development in Africa. But in developing the private sector, we get involved in a lot of development issues. And public-private sector partnership, as Mr. David mentioned, trade on one hand, infrastructure, the economy, even security. So at some point, we got involved in the climate change talks. I think I was in Copenhagen around the time you went for your first COP as well. That was in 2009. That was COP 15. And since then, we've been trying to join the conversation, shape the conversation, see how Africa could seize the window of opportunity, not just in terms of partnership with the rest of the world, but use the opportunity of developing key industries to do it straight on in a very clean way. So it's a very huge task. A lot of things are happening in Africa at the moment. Like Mr. Rob said earlier, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, started earlier this year with so much expectations. And we are not really seeing, and then, last year, COVID-19 and its impact on a lot of countries, particularly African countries, a lot of economies were shut down. So it's now bringing climate talk issues into it, which is the right thing to do, to look at, how can we do this, have a green economy, have a clean economy, clean industrialization. It could be both a benefit as well as a challenge, because there are so many gaps in developing major industries. So if we could seize the opportunity of doing it right from the onset in the right way, we could avoid the cost of transiting. But on the other hand, industries that are already existing, polluting the environment and all this, we need to take care of that. The other thing I would like to say, and maybe that could be a question to either you or Rob Davis, is you know that the world we operate in nowadays is such a very fragile world. In 2008, 2009, we had a global financial crisis. And the impact, that single impact on development, the way it affected the Millennium Development Goals, it took Africa off track. Now, with a major, now we are on the SDG drive. So the impact of what's happened under COVID-19 has not been measured. So what are the measures we have in place to mitigate these shocks? What measures do we have in place? In Africa, it's going, any shock, will really affect African economies because we don't have the system to take care of that. And at the same time, we want to do things right in a clean way, clean environment, clean energy, clean development. So, I'm just looking at both. How do you do both simultaneously? So it's something that I would like to hear. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, you want to take on that? And then after that, Aaron will speak a bit about it.
Yes. No, I think that's precisely the question that I was trying to address as well. I think that yes, as a continent, we've gone through a lot of shocks that were not of our making. As was pointed out by the moderator at the beginning, we hardly contributed to the climate change that's underway, but yet we are going to be affected by it if it happens in a catastrophic way. And we will be affected by the transition that's been made by the world to try to avoid that catastrophe. And so I think that we need to understand this. This is going to be a change and a disruptive change. And this disruption can be negative for us if we don't get our act together, to be quite frank. If we are left standing and this change happens and we find our trading partners start turning around and saying, well, your oranges or your mangoes have been produced with coal-fired electricity, which is contributing to global warming, and therefore we're not going to take it, which is a real possibility. Even if governments don't introduce measures like that, consumers might. And we find ourselves caught on the back foot like that, and we find that our coal resources can no longer be used. Eventually, our oil resources can no longer be used. Then I think we're going to find that this transition has been a hugely negatively disruptive one. To avoid that, I think in the first instance, what we've got to do is we've got to try to realize and build the opportunities that this transition creates. That's what I think it's all about. Now, I think this is a matter of projects and micro activities as well, but it's also a matter, I think, of getting the environment and the policies right. So I do think that the continental free trade area offers us one very, very important thing, and that is it offers us the possibility of operating at scale. That activities which would be confined to very small markets might now be able to find themselves operating on a much larger scale. So when we talk about things like regional value chains, we could have components for any kind of product, whatever it is that's produced in a regional value chain, emanating from multiple locations, producing products assembled in probably in multiple locations and consumed by consumers across the continent and also exported eventually. And I think that's the sort of promise it holds out. And this could lead to us raising the overall average value added of all our activities. Now, there's no reason why, as I was saying earlier, some of the green energy products could not also be produced in this way. I think what we've got at the moment, the production of green energy components, is too localized, too stuck in individual countries, at the same time as I think many others are using imports for all of their own whatever green energy projects they've got. So I think that that's the problem we've got, and that's what the opportunity that lies in our way. And I think it means, I really think that I'm hearing some very cynical remarks about the prospects of us getting our hands on the $100 billion. You pointed that out, that voices are beginning to say, well, don't count on it. There's donor fatigue. It's all shifted away from everything. So I think that while we need to still insist and argue for it, because it is a transition that's been forced on us, and we can actually do more if we are benefiting from it. Investing in us is not a bad thing, because then we will be able to make bigger commitments as a continent. But I think it's really to rely on our own resources to a considerable extent, but then also demand of the world at large. Don't start being predatory towards us. Don't try to dump your stuff on us in the name of climate change. Don't be unfair towards us as we are making this transition in terms of our traditional products. Look at what we've committed to and whether we're on track, and the UN process should guide it, rather than, I think, individual countries or individual blocks imposing their own regulations on us, which sometimes are actually not really motivated by green considerations, but actually are greenwash protectionism around industries which may, for other reasons, be less competitive in the developed world. So I think that's the challenge that we face. And I think it's very important that we insist on our right to industrialize, and we use the benefit that we've got of the free trade area, which could also go another direction. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be realize its potential. We have to work for that potential, identify the real projects that can take place, and work to ensure that the value chains begin to emerge and the continent industrializes. That's the only way I think that this transition is going to be one that supports our development, rather than create shocks that I think are going to probably be difficult for us to come to terms with.
Thank you very much. Aaron, your take on the points that Dotun has raised, your reflections on them?
Yes, Dotun, can you remind me, you were asking how do we achieve both things at the same time? Can you remind me which both things you were referring to?
No, how to, the parts, the transition to clean economy on one hand. On the other hand, we need to make preparation for shocks. Anything could happen, yeah. So, and we know how fragile the African economies are, number one. Then number two, we also know how any shock, how it affects, weak economies generally, and we have a lot of them in Africa. So, that's what I mean.
I think very much, in some ways, Dotun, you kind of summarized with that question, the adaptation and mitigation, drives, right? So mitigation is the drive to a clean economy, and adaptation is dealing with these changing conditions, unexpected shocks, all this stuff. And I think the complexity, I don't, hopefully this is gonna come across the right way, but some of these answers are kind of boring, just good old development work and creating resilient economies. One of the big challenges for both clean development and working on climate change is the fact that people are trying to put money into both things at the same time. Development over here, climate change over there. But actually, really good adaptation policy is just good agricultural development work, building farmer field schools, intercropping, using locally appropriate crops and whatnot. And then we go over to but the adaptation money is hundreds of millions of dollars, as we were talking about before, and it's very, very difficult to spend huge amounts of money like this on small scale farmers. So many countries have adaptation projects that are massive infrastructure projects around building sea walls to prevent sea level rise and building bridges and infrastructure. But really, the massive economic opportunity doesn't come from mega projects. It comes from empowering millions and millions and millions of people. And so I really think we need part of the main answer to your question, in my perspective, Dotun, is that although we need big projects and we need big change and we need to spend big money, a lot of the resilience to these shocks won't be felt or won't be benefited by a lot of that infrastructure, because infrastructure is inherently in one place. And all the people that are in need of the resiliency the most are often out in hard to reach areas and rural areas, et cetera. So again, I'll go back to my point of really empowering local people is going to be at the heart of all of the transitions that we want to see.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that answer. But to be sure, the shocks I'm talking about, I'm not talking about environmental shocks, climate or weather conditions, no. I'm talking about shocks in the global system, from the realm of security, from the realm of finance, from the realm of, and health system that could shut down the whole system. Yeah. That if anything happens, like that makes it practically impossible for where the funds we're expecting should come from. If they can't honor it, what facility do we have? Or can we put in place on our own? Or what?
It's a fascinating question. Yeah,
that's the question. Not necessarily whether.
Well, I would have a very short answer to that question, and then I'll let someone else jump in. I think it's all about social safety nets and government support for vulnerable populations in times of need. One of the biggest benefits that came to shocked people in Western countries was the Western luxury to just give unemployment money to people that didn't have jobs, and to give a monthly check to people during the crisis. And developing and particularly least developed countries simply cannot do that, right? Giving every citizen a monthly check for a year, this is impossible in Africa. But I think the answer to your question involves, rethinking that $100 billion per year. Does that $100 billion per year promised by developed countries, does it have to be used for big projects? Could it go into a social safety net? Could it go into a fund in every country to provide emergency relief? That's an interesting question that I think no one is really asking.
Can I just say on this? Can I just say on this one that, that I think that if we look at the post-COVID recovery, I don't think we're post-COVID yet, but I mean the recovery programs that have been underway. We see, according to UNCTAD, we see a vast disparity between large sums that have been used to promote recovery in the developed world and actually austerity, which has been practiced and preached to the developing world. And I think that UNCTAD has been talking about the very real possibility that we will see, and they're using a sort of South African euphemism for apartheid called separate development as we move along, that there will be a strong recovery in the developed world and something much more fragile in the developing world. I think that's what you're talking about. And I think that's a very, very, very real possibility that is staring us in the face right now, that we will come out of the COVID crisis much more fragile than we were. And some of the developed countries are going to come out of this quite well in the end of the day. Also, those that have been masters of technologies which have been accelerated use of during the COVID crisis. So, but I think that is a very, very, very big part of the challenge that we face. Our only sustainable and substantial way through this is to change our place in the global division of labor. As long as we remain, as we are producers and exporters of primary products used elsewhere, in an age where, in fact, the raw material is becoming a less and less important part of the final product. If you look at the value of the raw materials in a cell phone, it's a much smaller part than it was in products that were not part of the technology revolution. And I think that's the reality that we're confronting. But I think that we move into an era where, on top of those realities already implanted, where multilateralism is actually quite weak, where commitments at multilateral levels are often belied in practice, where we've got a trend towards block formation, where there's a lot of security instability in the world as well, probably looming, if not here already. We face, I think, two imminent mega challenges. One is the challenge of the digital economy. The other is the challenge of the low carbon economy, and those are going to strike us. And I think it's really, how do we position ourselves in the face of both of those, and given everything else? And I think that our long-standing answer that we need to move towards more complex, more higher value-added activities is the valid answer. And we've got to find that route through the move towards the lower carbon economy. So I think it would be nice if we got the funding, but I don't know whether it's coming.
Thank you.
And it would be nice if we could give it to people as a support for incomes. I don't have any objection to that.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I just wanted to follow up a question with Aaron on this question of adaptation and mitigation. Before the session began, I was reading an article by a Malaysian notable economist who was writing generally about COP26, and he made a comment to the effect that the private sector is more interested in mitigation efforts rather than adaptation, but he did not explain. And based on your experience, why is that the case, Aaron?
I think it's a really straightforward case. Mitigation has a lot of large scale programs and support structures for it that are very, very clear. It's about energy, energy, energy. And adaptation is much more complicated. Adaptation is, as I was saying before, it's either big infrastructure projects like dams and walls to prevent damage from sea levels, or in Bangladesh, all of the terrible flooding, et cetera, that's been happening over the last couple of years. Or it's either those big projects, or the other thing that adaptation is working with communities on helping them adapt to these changes. So it's very hands-on. It's mostly the biggest need is very difficult to create economies of scale around. So economies of scale for the renewables industry, we've seen in China with the dropping of the price of solar panels dramatically over the past 10 years. But adaptation project costs have gone up rather than going down. And so you see these two very, very important factors where, one, adaptation large scale is complicated and costs are going up rather than down, mean that the private sector and also governments are kind of disincentivized to work on adaptation, because everybody wants a headline. They want 2 gigawatts installed. Most countries, you don't see headlines around 50,000 farmers trained. That's actually a more important metric, in my view, than the energy at this point, because we already know how to do the energy. It shouldn't be huge news that somebody has 2 gigawatts. It should be huge news that we're doing something that we've never done before, which is the local empowerment.
Thank you very much. Looking at the clock, I see that we have 8 minutes to go. So I want to give 1 minute each to both Aaron and Davis to conclude their reflections. Then after that, Dr. is going to give a vote of thanks. So let's start with you, Aaron, since you spoke last. Then Mr. Davis will end it. Just your reflection about the topic we have discussed.
Yeah, I'll keep it short and bring it back to the multilateralism topic. As I mentioned before, we're always talking about, the question of whether multilateralism is dead or is failing or is changing now, especially looking at what's happening in the EU. But what we're building in Africa, as Mr. Davis mentioned at the outset, is the beginning of a new era of openness on trade and economic opportunity. And I think the African continent has an opportunity to make this first enormous trade agreement of the 21st century, one that the rest of the world should look at with inspiration. And we really need to have these opportunities flow across borders to unexpected countries. Looking to the the LDCs on the continent as the engines of growth for this new green revolution. And I think this has to be more not just about what we were talking about before with gigawatts and whatnot, but if you look at Nairobi, which was my home for the past 3 years, They are now calling it the Silicon Savannah. And the Silicon Savannah is the Silicon Valley of Africa. There are thousands and thousands of Web 3.0, whatever you want to call it, developers out there that are leading the economic charge of the virtual economy in Africa. And I think manufacturing is extremely important, but the economy of 21st century is the headlines are dominated by companies in the cloud, so to say. And again, I go back to my point about the most valuable resources in Africa being the human resources, because we can create the next major mega company that's doing good for the world, or at least not harming the world, here in Africa with the amazing talent that we have here. We just have to activate it, and we need multilateralism that is supporting those kind of economic changes, as well as the natural resource based and manufacturing based economies of the 20th century.
Thank you very much. Mr. Davis?
Well, I think that the whatever the circumstances and whatever factors there may be from the external environment, the fundamental challenge for Africa is to develop. That means to develop the human beings on the continent, to achieve human development, to elevate ourselves into much higher levels of human development, as, for example, measured by the UNDP. But along with that, I think we have to recognize that those countries that have high human development have also got high value-added activities, not necessarily all of them understood as manufacturing in the 20th century or 19th century sense, but also understood as innovation and as actually adding value to primary products and not dependent on the supply of primary products to be used in processes elsewhere. That's a fundamental transition that the continent has to undergo. And I think that what we need to do is we need to, when we face a challenge like the challenge of climate change, we need to identify those aspects of the adaptation and mitigation that can actually take that project forward. And we need to work together as much as we can. And we now have a new tool, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area. If we seize the opportunities, I think we can use this transition to benefit development on the continent. If we don't seize those opportunities adequately, then this is going to be a very disruptive challenge to us, and one I think disruptive, not in the positive sense, but one in the sense of creating more problems for the continent. If, by the way, we do have catastrophic climate change, I'm sure that we all know that Africa will be the place from which many climate refugees will be fleeing to other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now it's my pleasure to invite the organizer, Dotu, to give the closing remarks. I've been reminded from the technical moderators that we have exactly 3 minutes. So perform your magic within 3 minutes, Dotu.
Let me start by just going to Aaron's question to me about the motivation of behavior in organizing these. I find that question very hard. We just want to be part of the solution. Africa should be part of the solution to global problems. Africa should not be the problem. So from the private sector angle, working with governments, the behavior tries to do its best to see how African countries could be strong players in today and tomorrow's competitive global economy in a clean way. So within that context, I hope the conversation of today has contributed, to the general framework of discussion at COP26. But I think it's a conversation that should go beyond the framework of lines of COP26, which we do in November, December each year. It's something we should do regularly. So I think we should have more of this. We should stay engaged, let the conversation continues. On our own part, we'll try to institute that regularly. What lessons are we learning? What are the new things coming on board? What are the challenges we are facing? What are the measures to overcome them? What experiences can we share? And what are new ideas that we can put on the table in engaging government and engaging the private sector and engaging the international community? So on that context, in that note, I'd like to thank the speakers, Mr. Aaron Leopold. Thank you so much for honoring our invitation. Mr. Rob Davis, we are very grateful. And the moderator, Ambassador Olo Togo, we are very grateful. To the three of you, the only thing I could say is that just know that our appreciation is heartfelt. Thank you so much. We're grateful.
Thank you. So that brings the whole event to an end. And in fact, they have already locked us off. So that's it. Thank you very much, all of you, for participating. And we thank the technical moderators from Brussels. Goodbye.
Yes, thank you so much. And also to you, Mr. Otobo, we really appreciate the excellent moderation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Otobo. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.